The morning sun rose over New Haven settlement when she appeared at the northern gate, and the guards had never seen anyone like her before, and she stood almost 7 feet tall with skin that shimmered like silver mixed with blue, and her hair changed colors between purple and dark blue, and her eyes burned with bright amber light. And beside her was a small dragon, no bigger than a cat, with scales that sparkled with rainbow colors, and tiny wings that fluttered sometimes, and the creature had eyes that seemed far too smart for something so small. The woman spoke in a voice that sounded like singing and regular talking mixed together, and she said she needed to find Jake Murphy, because she required his help with something very urgent, and Lieutenant Amy Brooks was the guard at the gate that morning, and she could tell this tall woman was trying to look calm, but was actually very nervous because her hands shook a little, and the small dragon kept turning its head to look behind them, like something bad might be following. Amy asked for the woman's name and why she needed Murphy, and the tall woman said her name was Lyrelay from the Starweave Court, and she was the third daughter of the Eternal Grove, and the small dragon was named Shimmer, and they were bonded companions, and she explained that she needed Jake Murphy's help to stop a war that would destroy many worlds unless he agreed to help them again. Amy's eyes got narrow when Lyrelay said again, because that meant they had met before, and she asked about it, and Lyrelay's face softened, and she looked worried for the first time, and she explained that 2 years ago, Murphy had helped her people understand a sickness that was killing their sacred trees, and they thought it was a weapon from enemies. But Murphy proved it was just a natural thing from new sunlight patterns. And he saved many lives. Amy remembered hearing about that mission, and she knew Murphy was a scientist who studied alien life, and he was really good at understanding how different species thought and acted, and he had helped make peace between different alien groups before, but he liked working alone in his lab and did not like being involved in big political problems. Amy made a choice that would later be called either very smart or very dangerous, depending on who you asked, and she told Lyrelay to follow her. But the dragon had to stay visible at all times, and Lyrelay had to keep her hands where Amy could see them. They walked through the settlement streets, and everyone turned to stare because even though New Haven had many different alien species living there, Lyrelay and Shimmer still looked very unusual, and the little dragon seemed to enjoy the attention, and puffed out its chest and sometimes breathed out small sparkles that looked like tiny stars. Jake Murphy's lab was in the lower levels of the research building because he preferred to avoid crowds, and Amy knocked on the door and heard something crash inside and someone cursing in creative ways. The door opened and showed a man in his early 30s with messy dark hair and glasses sitting crooked on his nose, and he wore a dirty lab coat, and he blinked at them with brown eyes that always seemed to look through people instead of at them. Murphy said hello to Amy, and then his eyes moved to Lyrelay, and his whole face changed, and he said her name with surprise and asked if it was really her, and said she had grown so much. Lyrelay crossed the distance fast and picked him up in a huge hug that lifted his feet off the ground, and Shimmer flew off her shoulders and started flying in circles around both of them, while making happy chirping sounds. Amy decided this was above what she got paid for, and said she would file the visitor report, and asked if Lyrelay was allowed in Murphy's lab, and Murphy said yes, of course. While still looking shocked as Lyrelay put him down, Amy left and Murphy asked what was wrong, because the last message from Lyrelay's people said everything was going well. Lyrelay's bright eyes filled with something like tears that glowed with inner light, and she said everything had changed. And she explained that her sister Valana, who was the first daughter, had declared war on the Crimson Collective because she claimed they murdered their mother, who was the queen of the Eternal Grove, and Valana had gathered their warriors and woken up their war dragons and started a campaign of revenge that would not end until every Crimson world was burned. Murphy's face went pale, and he said the Crimson Collective was one of the most peaceful species in the sector, and they were philosophers and artists, not warriors. Lyrelay said she knew, and that was why she believed her sister was wrong and their mother's death had been declared natural by every healer who examined her. But Valana claimed she had proof that the Crimson had used a slow poison that looked like natural causes. And Valana had convinced the council and their people, and now their dragons were burning crimson worlds. Shimmer landed on Murphy's shoulder and pressed its small head against his cheek, making a sound like sad wind chimes. Murphy asked what exactly Lyrelay needed him to do, even though he already seemed to know the answer. Lyrelay said she needed him to do what he did best, which was find the truth. And she explained that her sister would not listen to her because she was too young and inexperienced. But Murphy saw patterns others missed and understood the spaces between what people said and what they meant. And if there was proof the Crimson were innocent, he would find it. And if there was proof they were guilty, he would find that too. Murphy asked, what would happen if he found proof they were guilty? Lyrelay's voice became hard as stone, and she said, then she would pick up a weapon herself and join her sister's war. But if they were innocent, then someone had tricked them into genocide, and she would not let her people become monsters. Because they were too blind to see truth. Murphy was quiet for a long moment, and then he looked at where Amy had gone and said he would need transport to Lyrelay's home system, and he would need full permission to investigate a possible war crime. Amy came back just then and said that would take time to get authorized. Lyrelay said they did not have time because every day more Crimson died, and every day her sister's forces grew stronger and more committed to the war, and every day whoever really killed their mother, if anyone did, had more time to cover their tracks. Murphy turned to his desk and started pulling up files on his computer, and he told Amy he needed everything they had on both the Verdant Collective and the Crimson Collective, including history and biology and psychology and recent politics and trade agreements and everything. Else Amy started to protest, but Murphy interrupted and said he could do this and he was going to do this, and his voice had steel in it that Amy had never heard before, and he said Lyrelay's people saved his life when he had an allergic reaction to alien spores, and he owed them, and more than that, he owed it to every innocent person who would die if this war continued, and he said he was going with or without authorization. Amy sighed, knowing she would regret this, and said she would make some calls, but warned Murphy that if this went bad, they would both end up court-martialed. Murphy said simply that being court-martialed was better than being part of genocide. As Amy left to start what would be a nightmare of paperwork, Lyrelay sank into a chair, looking suddenly exhausted, and Shimmer curled in her lap, and she stroked the dragon's scales. Without thinking, Murphy said Lyrelay had changed, and that she was scared, and the Lyrelay he knew 2 years ago was fearless. Lyrelay said softly that the Lyrelay from 2 years ago had never seen her people go to war, and she asked if Murphy knew what their war dragons were, and explained they were not like Shimmer, who was gentle and small, but were weapons their ancestors created long ago and locked in frozen sleep, and only brought out in dire need. And they were the size of human buildings and breathed fire that could melt stone, and her sister had awakened 30 of them. Murphy asked how many it took to destroy a city. Lyrelay whispered that it took just 1. Murphy walked to his window looking out over New Haven, and somewhere out there across the vast darkness of space cities were burning and people were dying, and at the center was a mystery that might be the key to stopping it all. He turned back to Lyrelay and said they had better hurry because he had a feeling whoever set this in motion was counting on them being too slow to stop it. Shimmer chirped in agreement, and small sparks of determination flickered in the dragon's eyes, and the war had begun. But the search for truth was just starting. The transport ship called Wanderer moved through space faster than light, and Jake stood in the observation deck watching stars blur past them, and his reflection looked like a ghost in the glass. And behind him, Lyrelay stood very still, with Shimmer coiled around her shoulders in an unusual way that showed tension. The authorization had come through faster than expected, with a short message from Admiral Kate Morrison that said, "Find the truth. Murphy and whatever it is, because we cannot afford another galactic war." And Jake thought to himself that there was no pressure at all. Lieutenant Amy Brooks said they would arrive in the Verdant system within an hour, and she had insisted on coming with them even though Jake protested, and she brought Corporal Nora Hayes, who was a tough soldier specializing in dangerous environments, and Amy asked Lyra Lee to explain what they would see when they arrived. Lyra Lee seemed to shake herself from deep thought and explained that the Eternal Grove existed on their homeworld, Verdantia Prime, and it was a forest spanning an entire continent, where trees grew taller than mountains and lived for thousands of years, and her people were born from the heartwood of these trees, and their lives were linked to them forever. And when a tree died, so did the one bonded to it. Jake asked gently about her mother, the Queen. Lirelai said her mother was bonded to the eldest tree, which was a being that had stood for 50,000 years, and when she died 3 months ago, the tree began to die too, and their healers tried everything, but both mother and tree died within days of each other. And it was treated as a great tragedy and a natural end to an impossibly long life, until Valana claimed she found evidence of poison. Nora asked what kind of evidence with her tactical mind already working through possibilities. Lyra Lee admitted that was what troubled her, because Valana would not show the evidence to anyone except the High Council, and she claimed it was too sensitive and too inflammatory, but the Council voted unanimously to support her war, and even their father, who always counseled peace, voted for war. Jake's mind caught on something, and he asked which died first, the mother or the tree. Lyra Lee blinked, her amber eyes widening, and she said the tree began to die first, by maybe a day, and asked why that mattered. Jake said that was not how poison works, because if someone poisoned her mother, she would show symptoms first, and her biology would fail, and then because of their bonding, the tree would follow. But if the tree died first, then the tree was the target, not the mother. Lyra Lee finished his thought saying, "Then someone poisoned a tree, not a person." Amy suggested someone who wanted to make it look natural because trees die, and ancient trees especially, and it is sad but expected. Lyra Lee said with rising energy that this tree was healthy though, and the eldest tree was examined by their best plant scientists just 1 month before it began dying, and they declared it sound and strong enough to live another 10,000 years easily. Jake began pacing with his mind racing, and he said, so they had a healthy ancient tree that suddenly begins to die, followed by its bonded partner, the Queen, and Valana claims to have evidence the Crimson Collective is responsible, and evidence so compelling that it overturned their entire culture's tendency toward peace, and now war dragons were being used against a species known for philosophy and art. Nora asked bluntly if Jake thought Valana was lying. Jake corrected her, saying he thought Valana believed she was telling the truth. But belief and truth were not always the same thing, and someone could have fed her false evidence, or she misinterpreted real evidence, or something else. The ship suddenly lurched violently, and alarms started screaming, and Jake was thrown against the wall. And Shimmer took flight with a shriek of alarm. Amy shouted for battle stations and all personnel and said, this was not a drill. They reached the bridge to find Captain Lisa Grant, gripping her chair with her face pale as she stared at the view screen, and there, filling the entire display, was a sight that made Jake's blood run cold. A war dragon. It was impossibly massive, with scales the deep green of ancient forests, and each scale was the size of a house, and wings that could have blocked out the sun, spread wide, and its eyes burned with inner fire, and it fixed on the wanderer with terrible intelligence, and when it opened its mouth, Jake could see the inferno building in its throat. Lisa shouted for evasive maneuvers, but Jake knew it was useless because they could not outrun something that size. Lirelai pushed past the crew with her hands raised, and she began to speak, but not in any language Jake recognized, and it was a song without words that was haunting and seemed to vibrate in his very bones. Shimmer joined in, and the small dragon's voice harmonized with Lyralay's in a way that seemed impossible, and the sound filled the bridge and filled the ship, and somehow impossibly filled the void of space beyond. The war dragon paused, and its mouth closed slowly, and it tilted its massive head, studying them with eyes that held the weight of thousands of years. Then, with a movement surprisingly graceful, for something so large it angled its wings and dove away, disappearing into the darkness. The bridge was silent except for the sound of heavy breathing and the slowly quieting alarms. Lisa asked carefully what that was. Lyralay said with a shaking voice that it was Thornfang, and he was her mother's companion before she bonded with the eldest tree, and he guards the approach to Verdantia Prime. Nora asked with disbelief if he just let them through, because Lyralay sang to him. Lyralay explained she sang him the Song of Passage, which was the melody her mother taught her when she was young, and it tells him she is coming home and bringing friends, not enemies. And then she turned to Jake with fear in her eyes and said, "Thornfang should not be here, because he was placed in frozen sleep after her mother bonded with the eldest tree, and only the High Council can awaken the war dragons, and they should all be with Valana's fleet attacking Crimson Worlds," Jake said quietly, unless someone wanted to make sure Lyralay could not come home, and someone who knew she might question the war. Before Lyralay could respond, the communications console made a sound, and Lisa pressed the button, and a holographic image appeared, showing a woman who could only be Lyralay's sister, though where Lyralay's features held warmth. Valana's were hard and carved from ice and fury, and her eyes were the same amber, but they burned with an intensity that bordered on madness, Valana said in a cold voice, "Little sister," and she wondered if Lyralay would come crawling home, and asked if she brought her pet human with her. Lyralay drew herself up and said Jake Murphy was a friend to their people, and he helped them before, and she asked for his help again. Valana sneered and asked help with what? Because the war is righteous, and Mother was murdered by crimson poison, and they will have their vengeance. Lyralay challenged her to show the evidence and let Jake Murphy examine it, and if it proves the Crimson are guilty, she will join the war herself. But if Valana is wrong and if she has been deceived, then what? Valana's composure cracked and rage flooded through, and she shouted she had not been deceived, and she held Mother as she died and felt the poison burning through her veins and found the crimson toxin in her chambers. Jake interrupted, stepping forward, and asked what toxin specifically did she find. Valana's eyes fixed on him, and Jake felt the weight of her hatred, and she said Crimson Bane, which was a substance the Crimson Collective developed centuries ago as a pesticide for their farm worlds, and in small doses it is harmless to most species, but in large, concentrated doses it attacks the nervous system of anything with plant-based biology. And her mother's people are born from trees, so they are as much plant as flesh. Jake's mind was already running through what he knew of Crimson Collective history, and he said Crimson Bane was banned by the Collective 200 years ago precisely because it was too dangerous, and they destroyed all samples and made its production a crime. Valana hissed that was what they claim. Yet she found a vial of it, pure and concentrated, hidden in a ventilation shaft in her mother's chambers, and a vial marked with crimson script. Jake said carefully, that was not evidence of the Collective's guilt, but evidence that someone wanted her to think the Collective was guilty, because anyone could have obtained Crimson Bane illegally, and anyone could have forged the crimson script. Valana's shout was like a physical force, and she said enough, and she did not ask for his opinion, and she gave her sister the courtesy of informing her that she has one day to present herself to the High Council and swear loyalty to the war effort, or she will be declared an enemy of their people, and Jake and his companions will leave their system immediately. Lyralay started to say please, but the transmission cut off. The bridge was silent for a long moment. Nora said finally that went about as badly as it could have. Jake said no, It went exactly as someone planned it to go and asked if they could see, and he explained that Valana found evidence just compelling enough to justify war, but not so compelling that it invites deep scrutiny, and she has been given an enemy to hate and a clear target for her grief, and just enough proof to silence doubters. Amy said so. Jake thinks she is being manipulated. Jake confirmed he thought someone was playing her like an instrument, and they were good at it, and good enough to fool an entire High Council. Raleigh said with determination hardening her features that they have one day to prove it, and she asked Captain Grant if she could take them to the surface. Lisa pointed out that Raleigh's sister just ordered them to leave. Raleigh said her sister does not command this vessel, and she does not yet rule their people, and she is third daughter of the Eternal Grove, and she invokes her right to return home, and her voice carried authority that made everyone straighten, and she said, "Take us down, Captain, because we have a conspiracy to unravel and a war to stop." As the Wanderer began descending toward Verdantia Prime, Jake watched the planet grow larger in the view screen, and somewhere down there was the truth, and he just had to find it before the galaxy burned. Shimmer chirped softly and settled on his shoulder as if to say, "We are with you." Jake smiled grimly, and they were going to need all the help they could get. Verdantia Prime was unlike anything Jake had ever seen, and he had seen more alien worlds than most humans alive. And the Eternal Grove stretched before them like a living cathedral with trees so vast that entire ecosystems existed in their upper branches, and glowing moss painted everything in shades of silver and blue, while flowers the size of buildings bloomed with petals that sang in the wind. The Wanderer had landed at a platform woven from living wood, and it was one of dozens that spiraled up the trunk of a tree that disappeared into the clouds above, and Raleigh stood at the edge of the platform with rigid posture as she looked out over her homeland. Amy breathed that it was beautiful, and even Nora's tactical assessment could not hide her awe. Raleigh said softly that it was dying, and Jake saw it then with the subtle browning at the edges of leaves, and the way some vines hung limp instead of vibrant, and the flowers that remained closed when they should be open. And she explained that without the eldest tree and without her mother, the grove mourns, and if they do not end this war and restore balance, the entire forest could die. Nora muttered no pressure while checking her equipment pack. A delegation approached from a spiral staircase carved into the tree's bark, and they were verdant like Raleigh, and tall and graceful, with their skin shimmering with different colors like forest green and deep brown and silvery white. But their eyes held suspicion as they looked at the humans. The leader was an ancient-looking man whose skin had the texture of aged bark, and he stopped before Raleigh and placed a hand over his heart, and he said, "Third daughter, and you return at a troubled time." Raleigh replied, matching his gesture, and said she returns because of the troubled time, and she brings Jake Murphy, who helped their people before, and he wishes to examine the evidence of her mother's murder. The elder, whose name was Oak Branch, had an expression that was already grave, but it darkened further, and he said, "The first daughter has decreed that the evidence is sealed because she fears it may be disturbed or contaminated." Jake stepped forward and said contaminated or examined too closely, and he meant no disrespect, but if the evidence is legitimate, it should withstand scrutiny, and in fact, proper analysis would only strengthen their case for war. The elder studied Jake with eyes that held centuries of wisdom and said, Jake spoke truth. And he remembered when Jake saved their young ones from the radiation sickness, and Jake asked for nothing in return. Jake said he asks for something now, which is access to the Queen's chambers, and access to the eldest tree's remains, and access to any records of the mother's final days. And if the Crimson Collective truly murdered their queen, he will find the proof. But if they did not, then what Oak Branch finished saying, then someone has deceived them into becoming murderers themselves. And he was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly and said, The first daughter is with the war fleet 3 days' journey from here, and in her absence he still holds authority as Elder of the Grove, and he grants Jake access, but Jake must work quickly, because when Valana returns, he cannot protect Jake from her wrath. Lyrelai asked if Jake could find the truth in 3 days. Jake thought of the complexity of alien biology and the intricacies of political manipulation and the countless variables that could hide or reveal guilt. And he admitted he did not know, but he was going to try. The Queen's chambers were preserved exactly as they had been the day she died, and it was a massive hollow within the eldest tree's trunk, with walls lined with living wood that still pulsed faintly with life, and personal effects were scattered about, including books written on pressed leaves and crystalline instruments that chimed softly when wind passed through the chamber's opening, and a bed woven from the softest moss Jake had ever touched. Oak Branch said the vial was found here and pointed to a ventilation shaft near the ceiling, and it was hidden inside a cavity that could only be reached by someone with knowledge of the chamber's construction. Jake examined the shaft carefully with Shimmer perched on his shoulder and peering curiously into the darkness, and he asked if this ventilation system connects throughout the tree. Oak Branch said yes, it allows for air circulation and helps regulate temperature. And then he paused and said they tested the air in all connected chambers, and no traces of Crimsonbane were found anywhere except in the vial itself. Jake murmured that was odd, because if the poison was airborne, there should be residue throughout the ventilation system, and if it was ingested, there should be traces in food or water, but a sealed vial hidden in a shaft. And he turned to Lyrelai and asked, how would the poison have been administered? Lyrelai admitted that is what troubles her because Mother was cautious about what she consumed, and she had food tasters, and no one else became ill. Jake asked what about the tree itself, and could the poison have been introduced directly into the eldest tree's root system? Oak Branch's eyes widened, and he said that would require access to the deep roots, which are the underground chambers where the eldest tree's primary root structure lies, and those chambers have been sealed for 1,000 years. Jake pressed and asked, can we see them? The journey to the deep roots took them down through the heart of the tree, past glowing fungi that cast everything in an ethereal glow, and past chambers where young Verdant were being educated in songs that taught history and science at the same time, and down to a level where the air grew thick with the scent of rich earth. The entrance to the deep roots was sealed with a door of living wood so tightly, woven that it appeared solid, and Oak Branch placed his palm against it and sang a note that made Jake's teeth ache, and the door slowly unwound, revealing a tunnel that descended into darkness. Nora said, "Wait," and her tactical instincts were flaring, and she pulled out a scanner and swept the area, then frowned and said she was reading recent disturbances in the soil structure, and someone has been down here and not 1,000 years ago, but within the last few months. They descended carefully with Shimmer, providing light from small, glowing motes that drifted from the dragon's scales, and the tunnel opened into a vast chamber where roots the size of buildings twisted and turned, creating a labyrinth of living wood, and in the center, a pool of water reflected their lights like a mirror. Oak Branch whispered that it was the heart pool, where the eldest tree drew sustenance from the deep waters, and if poison was introduced here, it would spread throughout the tree's entire system. Jake knelt by the pool, pulling out a portable analysis kit, and he took a sample of the water, running it through analysis while the others watched tensely. Minutes passed in silence. Then the results appeared, and Jake felt his blood run cold. He said quietly that it was Crimsonbane in the water and trace amounts. But it was here. Lyrelai breathed, that then it was true, and the crimson did poison her mother. Jake said sharply, "No," and told them to think about it, because Crimsonbane in high doses attacks plant-based nervous systems, but in trace amounts in water, it would take months or maybe years to accumulate enough to harm a tree this size, and this is not an assassination, but sabotage. Amy finished understanding, dawning, and said someone wanted to slowly kill the tree and make it look natural. Jake continued with his mind racing and said, but they got impatient because the tree was dying too slowly, so they needed to accelerate the plan and needed to make it look like murder instead of natural causes. So they planted the vial in the Queen's chambers marked with crimson script, just incriminating enough to start a war. Oak Branch demanded who would do this and who benefits from war between their peoples. Jake said, standing, that is the question, and who has access to this chamber, and who could come and go without raising suspicion. Oak Branch said slowly, only members of the High Council and the royal family, and all have been loyal for centuries. Jake pressed and asked all and every single one. Oak Branch hesitated and said there was one named Counselor Thorn who argued against the war initially and claimed the evidence was too convenient, but he was outvoted and he fell ill shortly after with a wasting sickness. And he passed 2 weeks ago. Jake and Amy exchanged glances, and Amy said darkly that was convenient. Jake said they need to examine Counselor Thorn's chambers now. But before they could move, Shimmer suddenly shrieked in alarm, and the little dragon launched from Jake's shoulder, flying in tight circles and breathing sparks of distress. Lyrelay said, someone is coming, and multiple people, and moving fast with her hand moving to the blade at her side that Jake had not even noticed. They scrambled back up the tunnel, but they were only halfway to the surface when figures emerged from the shadows above, and warriors in armor woven from the hardest wood carrying weapons that hummed with deadly energy. Leading them was a verdant Jake had not seen before, and a woman with skin the color of midnight and eyes that glowed with an unnatural red light. She commanded them to seize the outsiders by order of the first daughter because they are under arrest for conspiracy against the Grove. Oak Branch said with anger in his voice that Counselor Blackwood had no authority to arrest anyone because he granted them access. Blackwood said coldly that his authority is revoked because the first daughter has declared martial law and the time for questions has passed, and the humans will be held until they can be properly interrogated. Lyrelay demanded, stepping forward. What about her because she is third daughter? And will Blackwood arrest her as well? Blackwood smiled, and it was a terrible thing, and she said, dear Lyrelay will be brought before her sister to answer for her treachery, and Valana will decide her fate. As the warriors moved in, Jake's mind was racing, and the pieces were falling into place, forming a picture he did not like at all. And Counselor Thorn conveniently dead after questioning the war, and Blackwood appearing just in time to stop their investigation, and the war itself benefiting who and who benefited from the Verdant and Crimson destroying each other. The answer hit him like a physical blow, but before he could voice it, the warriors were upon them, and he felt rough hands grabbing him and heard Amy and Nora shouting in protest, and saw Lyrelay being restrained by 4 warriors while Shimmer darted around them desperately. As they were dragged away from the deep roots and away from the evidence that could stop a war, Jake caught Oak Branch's eye, and the elder looked stricken and conflicted. But Jake saw something else there too, which was determination. Help was coming, and they just had to survive long enough for it to arrive, and Jake had to figure out who was really pulling the strings before both the Verdant and Crimson peoples burned in a war neither of them truly wanted. The holding cell was woven from living vines so dense that not even light could pass through, leaving them in near total darkness. And Jake sat with his back against the cool, slightly damp wall, listening to the sounds of Amy pacing and Nora testing different sections of the wall for weaknesses. Nora reported that this is reinforced with some kind of electric field and she touches it wrong and gets a shock that makes her arm numb and they are not breaking out of here. Jake said quietly, they do not need to break out because they need to think their way out. Amy said with frustration evident in her voice that it was a great plan, and asked if Jake had any brilliant thoughts on how they do that when locked in a box. Jake closed his eyes, running through everything they learned, including the timeline of the Queen's death, and the placement of the Crimson Bane vial, and the poisoned water in the deep roots, and Counselor Thorn's convenient death, and Blackwood's perfectly timed intervention. He said suddenly that it is not about the Verdant or the Crimson, because it was never about them, and they are both victims. Lyra Lay's voice came from the darkness, because she was in a separate cell but close enough to hear, and she asked what Jake meant. Jake said, think about it. Because someone went to enormous effort to frame the Crimson Collective for murdering her mother, and they poisoned the eldest tree slowly, then accelerated the timeline when needed, and they planted evidence and eliminated opposition like Counselor Thorne, and positioned themselves to benefit from the chaos. But here is what does not make sense, which is why Frame the Crimson specifically, Amy suggested, because they wanted to start a war. Jake corrected her saying, no, they wanted to start this war between these two specific peoples, because the Verdant have war dragons, which are ancient weapons of incredible power, and the Crimson have something too, and he asked Lyrelai what that something is, and something that makes them a threat, despite being philosophers. There was a long pause before Lyrelai answered, and she said the Mind Weavers, which are Crimson Elders, who can link consciousness across vast distances, and coordinate fleets and share knowledge instantly, and it is how they built their civilization so quickly because they can think as one when needed, Jake said exactly with excitement. Building despite their circumstances, and whoever orchestrated this wanted both peoples weakened and the war dragons and the Mind Weavers locked in combat, destroying each other, and when both sides are exhausted and bleeding and vulnerable, then what Nora finished grimly saying, someone else moves in, and a third party that has been hiding in the shadows. Lyrelai breathed the name Blackwood, but she is just one counselor and she does not have the resources to do all this. Jake interrupted, saying she is not working alone because she cannot be, and this conspiracy is too big and too well coordinated, and there has to be a network and an organization with resources and reach across multiple systems. A soft chirping came from above, and everyone fell silent, and something small was moving across the ceiling of Jake's cell, with a familiar shimmering in the darkness. Jake whispered urgently, asking Shimmer how the dragon got there. The little dragon dropped onto his shoulder and pressed its head against his cheek, making sounds that were half chirp and half whimper, and it was frightened. Jake realized, but it had still come for them. More importantly, clutched in its tiny claws, was something that gleamed faintly, which was a data crystal. Amy asked, moving closer, what that was. Jake took the crystal, carefully examining it, and said it was standard. Verdant data storage, but where did Shimmer get this? Lyrelai gasped and said from Thorne's chambers, and she called Shimmer a brilliant creature and asked if the dragon went to Counselor Thorne's chambers and found this. Shimmer puffed out its chest proudly. Nora asked, can Jake access it without any equipment? Jake turned the crystal over in his hands, thinking, and Verdant data crystals were designed to interface with their glowing technology, but he had worked with enough alien tech to know that most of it was adaptable, and he asked Lyrelai if he passes this to her. Can she access it? Lyrelai said, if she can touch it to her skin, yes, because her people can interface directly with their technology. Jake said, Amy boost me up, and with Amy's help, he climbed high enough to reach the vines separating his cell from Lyrelai's, and they were dense, but there was a small gap near the top, and he pushed the crystal through and heard it drop. And then Lyrelai's sharp intake of breath. Jake asked urgently, what is it and what is on the crystal? Lyrelai said with a shaking voice that there are messages and encoded communications between Counselor Thorne and someone he was investigating, and he suspected a conspiracy but could not prove it. And he was tracking shipments and financial records, trying to find connections. Jake pressed and asked, and what did he find? Lyrelai said he found them. And 3 months before her mother died, there were unusual shipments to 14 different worlds, including both Verdantia Prime and the Crimson Homeworld. And the shipments were routed through shell corporations disguised as medical supplies and agricultural materials. Jake said, let me guess, and the contents included. Crimson Bane, Lyrelai said, among other things, and weapons and surveillance equipment and communications jammers, and then her voice grew harder, and she said, and funding with massive amounts of credits flowing from a source, Thorn could not trace, but he had a theory. Jake said, "Tell me." Lyra Lai said the Kresh Dominion. Jake felt the bottom drop out of his stomach because the Kresh Dominion was a mining group that had been expanding aggressively through this sector for decades, and they were ruthless and efficient, and always on the hunt for new resources, and both Verdantia Prime and the Crimson Homeworld sat on rare mineral deposits that the Kresh desperately wanted. Amy said, understanding the strategy that they cannot just invade because both peoples are too strong and too well established. But if they weaken each other first, then what Jake finished saying, the Kresh move in as peacekeepers, and they offer to mediate and to help rebuild, and in exchange for their generous assistance, they gain mining rights and territorial concessions and economic control. Nora said with grudging admiration that it is brilliant and horrifying, but brilliant because you start a war and let both sides exhaust themselves, then profit from the aftermath. Lyra Lai said Blackwood must be their agent because she joined the High Council only 5 years ago after the previous counselor died in an accident, and an accident that was never properly investigated, Jake said, because Thorn was the one who investigated it, and he found something that made him suspicious enough to keep digging. So they killed him too, and made it look like natural causes, and removed the one person who could stop the war, Amy said. But we know now, and we have evidence, and we can stop this, Jake asked quietly. Can we? And told them to think about where they are, because they are locked in cells and branded as conspirators, and the only person who would listen to them, which is Oak Branch, is likely under arrest himself by now, and Valana is still 3 days away with the war fleet, and Blackwood controls the Grove, and every hour they sit here, more people die in a war that never should have started. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of their failure because they had the truth, but truth without the ability to share, it was just another form of lie. Then Shimmer chirped with a sound that somehow managed to convey determination despite coming from a creature the size of a house cat. Jake asked, "What is it?" The little dragon flew to the vines that formed their cage and began pulling at them with its claws, and small, yes, but the claws were surprisingly sharp, and the vines began to fray. Lyra Lai called out, saying, "Shimmer, wait, because if you damage the vines enough to trigger the alarm, then—" "What?" But Shimmer was not listening, and the dragon worked with frantic intensity, pulling and tearing until a single vine snapped with a sound like a breaking bone, and immediately alarms began to wail throughout the complex. Nora muttered so much for stealth. But Jake was watching Shimmer, and he saw something in the dragon's eyes and something calculating, and the dragon was not panicking but had a plan. More vines snapped as Shimmer tore through them, creating a hole just large enough for the small dragon to slip through, and it dove into Jake's cell, chittering urgently and tugging at his sleeve. Jake said, "It wants us to follow." Amy looked skeptical, saying, "Through a hole that size, and we are not exactly dragon-sized." But the vines were weakening, and the electric field flickering as Shimmer's damage disrupted the cell's integrity, and Nora saw it, too, and threw herself against the wall with her full weight, and once and twice, and on the third impact, the entire section collapsed. They were free! Jake shouted for Lyra Lai, but the third daughter was already tearing through her own cell wall from the inside with her verdant strength, making short work of the damaged vines. Lyra Lai said they have minutes before guards arrive, and maybe less. Jake said then we run and told Shimmer to lead the way. The little dragon took off down the corridor, and they followed, racing through the living architecture of the Eternal Grove, as alarms wailed around them, and Shimmer seemed to know exactly where it was going, leading them down spiral staircases and through chambers filled with startled, verdant civilians who shouted in confusion as they passed. Amy panted, asking, "Where are we going?" Lyra Lai gasped, with understanding dawning, and said the communication spire, because Shimmer is taking them to the communication spire, and it is the only place they can send a message to Valana's fleet. Nora asked. "Will she listen?" Lyra Lai said. If they show her the evidence from Thorn's crystal, and if they explain the conspiracy, she has to listen because she is her sister, and she is angry and hurt. But she is not a fool. They burst out onto a platform where a tower of crystal wood spiraled upward, pulsing with light that represented data streams connecting Verdantia Prime to the rest of the galaxy, and guards were already moving to intercept them with weapons raised. Blackwood's voice echoed across the platform, saying, "Stop, because they are under arrest for treason against the Grove, and surrender now, and your deaths will be painless." Jake said, "Our deaths, and not even a trial, and that is not very subtle." Blackwood, or should he say, "That is not very subtle, Creche agent." Blackwood's expression flickered just for a moment, but it was enough, and it was confirmation. One of the warriors looked uncertain and asked Counselor, "What is he talking about?" Blackwood said smoothly, "The human is delusional, and he seeks to divide them with lies, while their people fight a righteous war and do not listen to him." Lyrelay shouted, holding up Thorn's data crystal, and said, "Then let us prove it, and let everyone see what Counselor Thorn discovered before he was murdered, and let them see the evidence of the Creche conspiracy." Blackwood said that Thorn died of natural causes, but her hand moved subtly to a weapon at her side. Jake urged the warriors, saying, "Show them, because they have served their people faithfully for years. And do not they deserve to know the truth, and do not they deserve to see the evidence before they follow orders to kill the Queen's daughter?" The warriors hesitated, looking between Blackwood and Lyrelay, and in that moment of uncertainty, Shimmer acted, and the little dragon flew straight at Blackwood, breathing a small gout of flame that, while small, was hot enough to make the counselor flinch back, and in the same motion, Shimmer snatched something from Blackwood's belt, which was a communication device, and flew it straight to Lyrelay. Blackwood said no, and lunged forward, but Lyrelay was already activating the device and already channeling the data from Thorn's crystal into the communication spire's network, broadcasting it across the entire system. For a moment, nothing happened. Then across Verdantia Prime and across every screen and interface. Connected to the Grove's network, the evidence began to play, including financial records and shipment manifests, and encoded messages between Blackwood and her Creche handlers, and plans for the war and strategies for weakening both peoples and projections for profits once the Creche Dominion moved in as saviors. And at the center of it all, a recording of Blackwood herself, standing over Counselor Thorn's body, reporting to her superiors that the last obstacle has been removed. The warriors lowered their weapons, staring at Blackwood with horror and betrayal. Blackwood snarled that this is fabricated. But her voice held no conviction, and the humans created this to deceive them. A voice cut through the air that was cold as ice and sharp as a blade, saying enough. A massive shape descended from the sky with wings beating with hurricane force, and Thornfang, the ancient war dragon, landed on the platform with enough force to crack the living wood, and riding on its back was Valana, with her eyes blazing with terrible fury. But this time, Jake saw the fury was not directed at them. It was directed at Blackwood. Lyrelay breathed the word. Sister Valana dismounted in a single fluid motion, stalking toward Blackwood with murder in her eyes, and she hissed that Blackwood made her a weapon and fed her lies and manipulated her grief and turned her into a monster who burns innocent worlds and used her mother's death to start a war. Blackwood said, backing away, that she did what was necessary, because the Creche Dominion represents order and progress and profit, and their backward peoples were nothing. She never finished the sentence because Valana moved faster than human eyes could follow, with her hand closing around Blackwood's throat. Valana whispered that her mother believed in peace and believed in understanding, and believed that all peoples, no matter how different, could find common ground, and her grip tightened, and she said Blackwood murdered her mother and murdered Thorn and murdered thousands in a war built on lies. And give me one reason why I should not tear you apart. Right here, Jake said quietly, stepping forward, because she is more valuable alive, and she can testify and can expose the entire Kresh conspiracy and can bring down every agent they have placed across the sector, and dead. She is just another casualty, but alive she can help save the lives her lies have destroyed. Valana looked at him, and for a long moment, Jake thought she might kill Blackwood anyway. And then slowly she released her grip, letting the traitor collapse gasping to the ground. Valana ordered the warriors to take Blackwood to the deepest cell they have and guard her with their lives because she will face justice for what she has done. As Blackwood was dragged away, Valana turned to face Lyralay, and the two sisters stood staring at each other, and Jake saw the weight of everything that had happened written in their eyes. Valana said with her voice breaking that she almost destroyed them, and she almost became exactly what their enemies wanted. Lyralay said, crossing the distance between them and pulling her sister into an embrace, but she did not. And she stopped, and she listened. And that is what matters. Valana whispered about the Crimson Worlds, and how many did she attack, and how many died because she was too blind to see the truth. Lyralay promised they will make it right, and they will tell the Crimson what happened and offer reparations and rebuild what was destroyed, and they will do it together. Valana pulled back, looking at Jake, and said the human Jake Murphy and her sister spoke truly because he saved them. Jake said he helped, but the real hero is that dragon. And he pointed to Shimmer, who was preening proudly on Lyralay's shoulder, and it found the evidence and freed them from cells and gave them the chance they needed. Shimmer chirped modestly, though its puffed-out chest suggested it agreed completely. Valana said, "Then they both have the eternal gratitude of the verdant people." And she turned to the communication spire, saying she must contact the fleet and order them to stand down immediately, and then she took a deep breath and said, then she must contact the Crimson Collective and beg their forgiveness for crimes she can never truly atone for. As Valana moved to the communications spire, and as the truth spread across the system, and as the machinery of war slowly and painfully began to reverse course, Jake felt Amy's hand on his shoulder. Amy said, "We did it, and we actually did it." Jake corrected, saying, "We stopped one war, but the Kresh Dominion is still out there, and their conspiracy just got exposed, but they still have resources and influence and power, and this is not over," Amy asked. "So what do we do?" Jake smiled grimly, saying, "We do what we do best, and we dig deeper, and we find the truth, and we make sure that anyone who tries to profit from innocent people's suffering pays the price," Shimmer chirped in agreement, breathing a small shower of sparks that looked almost like fireworks. 3 weeks had passed since the truth had shattered across the Verdantia system like breaking glass, and Jake stood on a platform overlooking the Eternal Grove, watching as Verdant and Crimson delegates worked side by side with their previous hatred, replaced by the awkward but genuine effort of peoples learning to trust again. The Crimson Collective had responded to Valana's confession with more grace than Jake thought possible, and their lead negotiator, named Azure, had arrived with a delegation that included families of the fallen, and instead of demanding revenge, they had asked for truth and reconciliation. Azure had said in their first meeting with a voice like wind through crystal that they understand grief, and they understand how it can be twisted into a weapon, and the Kresh Dominion committed these crimes, not the verdant people, and they will mourn their dead together. Now those same peoples were building a memorial at the base of the eldest tree's remains, and it was a monument that honored both verdant and crimson losses, and it was built in a style that blended both cultures with living wood, shaped by verdant artisans mixed with the crystal sculptures the crimson were famous for. Lyralay's voice came from behind Jake, saying, "Beautiful, is it not?" And she looked different than she had 3 weeks ago, and older somehow, carrying the weight of the war and its aftermath with visible grace, and Shimmer rode her shoulder as always with the little dragon, having become something of a celebrity among both peoples. Jake agreed it was beautiful and asked how the negotiations were going. Lyralay said slowly but well, and the Crimson are helping them understand the damage to their war dragons from the battles, and it turns out their mind weavers can soothe the dragons' minds and help them return to frozen sleep peacefully instead of fighting them the way they would have, and she smiled, saying they are teaching techniques the Verdant never knew existed, and in return, they are sharing knowledge of living architecture and sustainable ecosystem management. Jake said, turning enemies into partners. And that is the best revenge against the Kresh they could possibly have. Lyra Lay's expression darkened at the mention of the Dominion, and she asked if Jake heard from Admiral Morrison and has the investigation turned up any more. Kresh agents, Jake said, 7 so far, scattered across different systems and all working to destabilize various governments and create conflict. And he pulled out his datapad, scrolling through reports, and the Kresh Dominion is claiming they are rogue actors and individual criminals not sanctioned by the corporate leadership. Lyra Lai asked, "Do you believe that Jake said not for a second, because this conspiracy was too well funded and too coordinated, and it went all the way to the top, but proving it is another matter?" Lyra Lay asked if Blackwood is still refusing to testify about her handlers. Jake said she is smart enough to know that the moment she gives up names, she loses her leverage, and she is asking for full immunity and relocation to a protected world in exchange for her cooperation. Lyra Lay's hands clenched, and she said, after everything she has done and the lives she destroyed, she wants to walk free. Jake said quietly that justice and strategy do not always align, and if her testimony can bring down the entire Kresh conspiracy and prevent future wars and save thousands of lives, is that worth letting one murderer escape punishment? Lyra Lay challenged him, asking, "Is it? And where does it end, Jake? Because if we compromise our principles to achieve practical results, what separates us from them?" Jake did not have a good answer to that, and it was a question that had haunted him throughout his career, which was the eternal balance between idealism and practical thinking. Before he could respond, Amy appeared on the platform, moving with urgency that meant important news, and she said, "Jake and Lyra Lay, you need to see this now." They followed her to a command center that had been established in one of the Grove's larger chambers, and screens showed various data feeds and communication channels and surveillance networks that spanned the sector, and Valana was already there along with Azure and several other high-ranking officials from both peoples. Jake asked what happened. Valana turned, and he saw the fury in her eyes, and she said the Kresh Dominion just issued a statement, and they are calling us liars. On the main screen, a Kresh executive who looked like someone had dressed a boulder in expensive corporate clothes was speaking to assembled media from dozens of worlds. The executive was saying that the so-called evidence against Kresh Dominion has been thoroughly examined by their internal review board, and they have determined that it is an elaborate trick created by people who hate corporations and seek to damage their reputation, and Counselor Blackwood was a rogue agent who infiltrated Verdant society on her own, and they had no knowledge of her activities and condemned them completely. Nora said, appearing next to Jake, that this is absurd, because they have financial records and communication logs and direct evidence linking their corporate accounts to the conspiracy. Amy pointed out that they are claiming the evidence is forged, and without Blackwood's testimony proving it, and without someone on the inside confirming the chain of command, it becomes a matter of our word against theirs. Azure said, with their crystal voice taking on a harsh edge, that they are using their economic power, and already they have seen trade agreements with neutral worlds being changed, and shipping contracts canceled, and investments pulled, and the Kresh are making it clear that if you side with us, you face economic consequences. Valana said bitterly that many worlds will choose economic stability over justice, and they will accept the Kresh explanation because the alternative is too costly. Jake stared at the screen with his mind racing through scenarios because the Kresh had resources they could not match and influence in places they could not reach, and the advantage of being able to claim victim status while using economic weapons. He said finally that they need Blackwood to testify, and it is the only way. And he asked Azure if their people have mind weavers who can share consciousness. Azure said yes, but what does that have to do with anything? And then stopped with understanding dawning and asked if Jake wants to use a mind weaver to share Blackwood's memories and make them available for others to experience directly. Jake said it would be proof that cannot be argued with and not a testimony that could be claimed as forced, but actual memories and actual experiences shared openly for anyone to witness. Azure said carefully, "There are ethical concerns, because mind-weaving is done with consent among their people, and to force it upon someone, even a criminal, violates principles they hold sacred." Lyralay said, catching on to Jake's plan but she can consent, and they offer her the deal she wants, which is full immunity and relocation in exchange for allowing a mind-weaver to access her memories of the conspiracy, and she goes free, but the truth goes public in a form the Kresh cannot lie about. Valana looked troubled, saying it feels wrong because she murdered their mother and murdered Thorn and started a war, and they reward her with freedom. Jake corrected gently that they reward her with life, and they use her crimes to prevent future ones, and he is not saying it is fair, Valana, but he is saying it might be necessary. The room fell silent as everyone considered the implications. Finally, Azure spoke, saying they will consult with their High Council, and if they agree, they can provide a mind weaver for the process, but the decision to offer Blackwood immunity must come from Valana's people, because it is her justice. Blackwood has escaped, and her forgiveness she requires. Valana closed her eyes, and Jake saw the struggle written across her features, and then she opened them, and her gaze was clear if pained. She ordered them to bring Blackwood here and let them offer her the deal, and for her mother and for all those who died, let them ensure that their deaths at least purchase the truth. The negotiation with Blackwood took place in a sealed chamber with only Jake and Valana and Lyralay and Azure present, and the fallen counselor looked worn down with her once perfect appearance, now ragged from weeks in prison, but her eyes still held cunning. Blackwood stated her terms, saying full immunity and guaranteed relocation to a world of her choosing under a new identity and a financial settlement enough to live comfortably, Valana said with a cold voice. And in exchange you submit to a crimson mind weaver who will extract your memories of the conspiracy and make them publicly available. And every meeting with your Kresh handlers, and every order you received, and every crime you committed, all of it exposed for the galaxy. To see Blackwood's expression flickered with uncertainty for the first time, and she asked if they want to violate her mind. Jake said they want the truth and she can speak it, and they have to hope people believe her, or she can show it in a way that cannot be denied, and in a form that the Kresh Dominion cannot claim is fake. Blackwood asked, what if she refuses? Lyralay leaned forward, saying, then she stands trial here on Verdantia Prime for the murder of Queen Silverleaf and Councillor Thorn, and for conspiracy to commit genocide, and for crimes against both their peoples, and the penalty she should mention is to be bound to a dying tree and left to die along with it, and it takes weeks, and very painful weeks. Blackwood's composure cracked, and she said they cannot do that. Valana said flatly they can. And they are bending their laws to their breaking point to offer her this deal, and she should take it or face justice the traditional way. There was a long silence. Blackwood asked. Finally, how does she know they will honor the agreement? Jake admitted she does not know, and she has to trust that they are better than she is, and that their word means something, and that they will not lower themselves to her level of lying, even when it would be convenient. Another silence, and longer this time. Then Blackwood laughed with a bitter, broken sound, and she said, the funny thing is, she actually believes them because they are too noble and too principled, and it is going to be their downfall someday. Valana asked, maybe, but not today, and do they have a deal? Blackwood looked at each of them in turn, then nodded slowly, saying, they have a deal. The mind-weaving ceremony took place in a public forum broadcast across dozens of worlds, and the Crimson Mind-Weaver was an ancient being named Chorus, whose very presence seemed to make the air harmonize, and they sat across from Blackwood in a circle of crystal and light. Chorus warned that this will not be pleasant, because they will have access to her deepest memories and her darkest secrets, and they will see everything she is and everything she has done, and they will share only what is relevant to the conspiracy, but they will see all Blackwood muttered to just get it over with. Chorus extended their hands, and when they touched Blackwood's temples, light exploded outward, and the gathered witnesses, including Jake and the others, suddenly found themselves immersed in memory. They saw through Blackwood's eyes as Kresh executives laid out their plan, and they were beings motivated purely by profit and resource gain, and they felt her hesitation brief and quickly pushed down as she accepted her role in the conspiracy, and they experienced her planting the poison vial in the Queen's chambers and poisoning the deep roots, and standing over Counselor Thorne's dying body with cold satisfaction, and they saw the vast network of Kresh agents and dozens of them spread across the sector like a web, and names and faces and locations all laid bare in perfect detail. When it was over, and when Chorus released Blackwood and the memories faded, there was complete silence in the chamber, and then someone began to weep, and others joined in with both Verdant and Crimson, mourning together for the innocents lost, and the lives destroyed, and the trust shattered. But they were also unified in a new way and bonded by shared trauma and shared truth. Azure announced with their voice carrying across the chamber that the evidence has been recorded, and it will be shared freely with all worlds, and all governments and all peoples who wish to see it, and the Kresh Dominion can deny words, but they cannot deny what they have all witnessed. Blackwood stood shakily, looking smaller somehow and diminished by having her deepest self exposed, and she asked quietly about the deal. Valana said, though her voice held infinite sadness, that it will be honored, and Blackwood has her freedom, and she hopes Blackwood finds no peace in it. As Blackwood was led away to begin her new life, Jake felt Lyra Lay's hand slip into his. She asked softly, "Is this what justice looks like because it feels hollow?" Jake admitted that justice often does, but told her to look, and he gestured to the crowd and to Verdant and Crimson standing together and to the memorial being built and to the future being forged from the ashes of conspiracy. And he said Blackwood does not get to see this, and she does not get to be part of the healing and the rebuilding and the new alliances being formed, and she gets to live, yes, but she lives alone, and in hiding, knowing that the peoples she tried to destroy are thriving together. Lyra Lai asked about the Kresh Dominion. Jake pulled up his datapad showing the latest reports, and he said already, worlds are cutting ties with them, and the evidence Chorus extracted is sparking investigations across 24 systems, and the Dominion stock has crashed, and their executives are facing criminal charges, and several of their colony worlds are declaring independence. Lorelei asked, "So we won?" Jake corrected, saying we survived, and sometimes that is the same thing. A week later, Jake stood once more on the platform overlooking the Eternal Grove preparing to leave, and the Wanderer had been refueled and resupplied, and Captain Lisa Grant was eager to return to human space with the news of their success. But saying goodbye was harder than Jake had anticipated. Valana approached first, with her bearing regal, despite the scars the war had left on her spirit, and she said Jake Murphy, and she owes him a debt she can never repay, because he showed her the truth when she was blind and saved her from becoming a monster. Jake said she saved herself, and he just gave her the tools. Valana said, nevertheless, and placed a hand over her heart, in the traditional Verdant gesture of respect, and said, "He will always be welcome in the Eternal Grove, and him and his descendants for all the generations to come." Next came Azure with their crystal form chiming softly in the breeze, and they said the Crimson Collective also offers gratitude to Jake Murphy, because he proved that truth can overcome lies, and that understanding can bridge even the widest divides. Jake said he had a lot of help, and glanced at Lyra Lai and Shimmer. Finally, Lorelei stepped forward, and Jake saw tears in her amber eyes, and she said she supposes this is farewell. Jake said for now, but he has a feeling their paths will cross again. Lorelei said she hoped so, and pulled him into an embrace that lifted him off his feet, just as she had when she first arrived in his lab all those weeks ago, and she said thank you, Jake Murphy, for believing in them and for never giving up. When she set him down, Shimmer launched from her shoulder and landed on his chirping. Sadly, Jake said he will miss the dragon too, and he scratched under Shimmer's chin and told the dragon to keep its partner safe. Shimmer chirped agreement, then returned to Lorelei's shoulder with obvious reluctance. As Jake boarded the Wanderer, and as the ship lifted off and the eternal grove fell away below them, he looked back at the world they were leaving. And Verdantia Prime was healing, and the Crimson and Verdant were building something new together, and the Kresh conspiracy was falling apart. They had won not through violence or lies, but through persistence, and through the stubborn refusal to accept easy answers or comfortable falsehoods. Amy said, joining him at the viewport, that it was quite an adventure. Jake agreed, though he said he could do without being arrested and threatened and nearly killed, quite so much. Amy laughed, asking, "Where is the fun in that?" As the stars stretched into lines, and the Wanderer jumped to faster-than-light travel, Jake allowed himself a small smile, because somewhere out there other conspiracies were brewing, and other wars were being manufactured, and other peoples needed someone stubborn enough to find the truth, and when they called, he would answer. After all, that is what he did best. The war was ending, and the healing was beginning. But the fight for justice was just getting started.